Admiral Cale Morrow stood alone in the Hall of Gratitude in Geneva, his boots clicking against the cold marble floor as he walked toward the Great Wall at the far end of the chamber. The wall was made of black stone, polished so smooth that he could see his own reflection staring back at him, an old man with gray hair and tired eyes who had spent his entire life waiting for a moment he hoped would never come. Carved into the stone, in letters of gold, were 12 names, 12 species, 12 debts that humanity had never forgotten. He reached out and touched the third name on the wall, the Aelori, and let his fingers rest there for a long moment before pulling his hand away. 200 years ago, humanity had been dying. The Kethvari plague had arrived without warning, a bioweapon released by a species that no longer existed, drifting through space on the currents of an ancient war that had ended long before humans ever looked up at the stars. Stars and wondered what was out there. The plague attacked human DNA at its core, unraveling it like thread pulled from a sweater. And within 6 months, half the population of Earth was sick and a quarter of them were dead. Humanity had only just made first contact with the galaxy 10 years before the plague arrived, and they were nobodies in the grand scheme of things. A small, young, unimportant species on a small, blue, unimportant world at the edge of the Milky Way. The Galactic Concord, the great coalition of 4,000 spacefaring civilizations, had looked at the dying humans and shrugged its collective shoulders. Quarantine protocols were issued, and Earth was sealed off from the rest of the galaxy, left to suffer and die alone because the Concord did not waste resources on species that had nothing to offer in return. But 12 species had defied the quarantine. The Aelori, gentle insectoid beings who communicated through harmonic vibrations, and had never fought a war in their entire history, were the third species to break through the Concord blockade around Earth. They came in unarmed medical ships, carrying gene repair nanites that their scientists had worked day and night to modify for human biology. And they delivered those nanites to every hospital on every continent without asking for a single thing in return. The Concord punished them for it, stripped their trade privileges, imposed sanctions that crippled their economy for decades, and publicly condemned them as reckless fools who had endangered galactic biosecurity. The Aelori accepted the punishment without complaint, and when a human ambassador traveled to their homeworld years later to thank them, the Aelori High Queen had simply said that suffering was not something you watched from a distance when you had the power to stop it. Humanity survived the plague because of the 12 benefactors. And on the day the last patient was declared cured, every nation on Earth came together and swore a blood oath of repayment, a promise carved into black stone and sealed with the signature of every world leader, every military commander, and every citizen who chose to add their name. The galaxy thought it was charming. They thought it was the kind of sentimental, emotional gesture that young species made before they grew up and learned how the universe really worked. Cold, transactional, and utterly indifferent to something as naive as gratitude. The galaxy moved on and forgot about the oath. Humanity did not. Morrow turned away from the wall when his communicator buzzed against his wrist, and he looked down at the screen to see a Priority 1 message from Earth's diplomatic listening post on the outer rim. He opened it and read the words that changed everything. The message was short and encrypted with Aelori harmonic ciphers that only a handful of humans knew how to decode. And it said, "They are coming for our world, and the Concord will not act, and we have no one left to ask." Morrow read it twice, then a third time, and then he closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall. The Vraxith Dominion had been a growing shadow on the edge of the galaxy for the past 50 years, a militaristic empire that expanded not through open war, but through economic strangling, political manipulation, and the slow, patient absorption of weaker species into vassal states that existed only to serve Vraxith interests. The Concord tolerated them because the Vraxith controlled 6 of the 12 major hyperspace corridors that connected the galaxy's trade networks, and no one wanted to risk an economic collapse over the fate of a few minor species that most people could not even name. The Alori were one of those minor species. Their world sat at the edge of Vraxith space, rich in rare crystalline minerals that the Dominion wanted. And the Alori had no military, no allies powerful enough to intervene, and no leverage within the Concord to force a diplomatic resolution. They were going to be swallowed whole, and no one in the galaxy cared enough to stop it. No one except humanity. Morrow walked out of the Hall of Gratitude and into the cold Geneva night, and he made a single call to the Unified Command Center buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps. The woman who answered was General Priya Vashar, the commander of Earth's Strategic Defense Network, and she listened in silence as Morrow read her the Alori message word by word. When he finished, there was a pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Which benefactor number are they?" Vashar asked. 3, Morrow said. Another pause, shorter this time. "I will wake the council," Vashar said, and her voice carried the weight of something that had been building for a very long time. Not anger, not excitement, but the quiet, deliberate strength of a plan that was finally coming into motion. Steady certainty of a species that had been waiting for this call for 150 years. Within the hour, the full Security Council of Earth's Unified Command was assembled, and the vote was unanimous. Every single hand raised without hesitation. The resolution was simple, and it was absolute. The Alori are benefactor number 3, and they have called upon the oath, and humanity remembers its debts. Morrow stood at the back of the room and watched the commanders and generals begin issuing orders that would set in motion the largest military operation in human history. And he felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, not quite, but something close to it. He thought about the Alori High Queen, who had told that ambassador so many years ago that suffering was not something you watched from a distance. He thought about 12 species that had risked everything to save a world full of strangers. And he thought about the galaxy, vast and deep, cold and utterly certain that humanity was small and weak and sentimental and foolish. They were about to learn how wrong they were. For 150 years, the galaxy had looked at humanity and seen exactly what humanity wanted them to see. A minor species with a handful of colony worlds, a modest trade fleet, and an almost embarrassing habit of expressing emotions in public. They saw humans cry at funerals and laugh too loud at celebrations, and hug each other in greeting, and they shook their heads and made notes in their diplomatic files that said things like emotionally unstable and strategically insignificant and unlikely to ever become a major power. They were not wrong about the emotions. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. Deep beneath the surface of Luna, Earth's moon, a facility called Longbow Station had been operating in total secrecy for 147 years. It had no official designation in any government database, no budget line in any public record, and no entry in any galactic intelligence archive. Who knew about it understood with absolute clarity that the survival of the project depended on the galaxy never learning it existed. Longbow Station was where humanity built its war machine. The project had begun just 3 years after the blood oath was sworn, when the first generation of scientists and engineers who had survived the plague sat down together and asked a simple question. If the day ever came when one of the 12 benefactors needed help, would humanity be strong enough to answer the call? The answer at that time was no. Humanity had barely survived a plague. Its technology was primitive by galactic standards, and its military consisted of a few patrol ships that could not have won a fight against a Concord garbage scow. So they built, quietly and patiently, for a century and a half. The gene repair nanites that the Aelori had given them became the foundation for a revolution in human bioengineering that produced soldiers who could heal from wounds in hours instead of weeks. The jump drive technology that the Tholani, Benefactor Number 7, had shared was reverse-engineered, improved, and then improved again until human ships could make hyperspace jumps that were faster and more accurate than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The shield harmonics that the Dravani, Benefactor Number 1, had donated were studied and rebuilt into defensive systems so advanced that longbow engineers privately joked that human warships were harder to kill than cockroaches. And the warships themselves were something the galaxy could not have imagined. They were built inside hollowed-out asteroids and dead moons, assembled piece by construction crews who lived and worked in secret for years at a time. And when the last bolt was placed and the last system tested, each ship was sealed inside its stone shell and left to sleep until the day it was needed. 800 capital warships, 1,000 support vessels, 2 million ground troops trained in combat doctrines that no galactic species had ever encountered, because those doctrines were designed by humans who studied every war the galaxy had ever fought, and then asked themselves what would happen if someone was crazy enough to do the things that everyone else considered unthinkable. Commander Lyra Osei was one of the architects of those doctrines, and she was the one General Vashar chose to lead the liberation of Aelori Prime. Osei was 46 years old, born on a colony world called New Mombasa, and she had spent her entire adult life training for a war that she sometimes wondered would never come. She was brilliant in the way that made other officers uncomfortable, not because she was smarter than them, which she was, but because she thought about violence with a kind of creative joy that most people found unsettling. She did not want to hurt anyone, but if hurting someone became necessary, she intended to do it so effectively that the enemy would lose the will to fight before they lost the ability to fight. When Vashar called her into the briefing room and told her that the Aelori had invoked the oath, Osei smiled. Not a cruel smile, but the smile of someone who had trained for a marathon her entire life and had just heard the starting gun. "How long do I have?" she asked. "The Vraxith occupation fleet will reach Aelori Prime in 19 days, Vashar said, "and we need you there in 17. "I can do it in 14, Osei said. She walked out of the briefing room and began issuing orders. And within hours, the sleeping warships began to wake. Across the solar system and in hidden stations scattered through a dozen star systems, stone shells cracked and fell away like eggshells. And the ships that emerged were black and angular and covered in names, every hull bearing the names of the 12 benefactors in gold lettering. Could be seen from kilometers away. The Terran repayment fleet moved through space in formation, and for the first time in human history, the full scale of what humanity had been building was visible to anyone with a sensor array pointed in the right direction. Galactic intelligence agencies detected the fleet within hours, and the reaction was immediate and panicked. The Concord High Parliament demanded an explanation, and 17 ambassadors from 17 different species sent urgent messages to Earth's diplomatic offices, asking what in the name of every god in the galaxy was happening. Director Yuna Tanaka, Earth's senior representative to the Concord, received all 17 messages and responded to none of them for exactly 12 hours, long enough to make every government in the galaxy deeply nervous, before she stood before the Concord communication array and delivered a statement that would be replayed on every world with a data feed for years to come. She was 73 years old, small and thin, with white hair and steady hands, and she spoke in a voice that was so calm it was almost gentle. 200 years ago, 12 species risked everything to save humanity from extinction, she said. And today, one of those species has asked for our help, and we are answering that call. And I want to be absolutely clear about what this means. She paused and looked directly into the array's recording lens. Humanity is repaying a debt, and anyone who stands in our way will be considered complicit in the suffering of those who showed us kindness when we had nothing to offer in return. And this is not a request for permission, and this is not an invitation to negotiate, and this is not something that is open to discussion. She ended the transmission without waiting for a response. The Vraxith Dominion received the message and laughed. Their military commanders looked at the size of the human fleet and compared it to their own forces, and calculated that they outnumbered the humans 3-1 in capital ships and 5-1 in total tonnage, and they sent a message to their occupation fleet at Alori Prime, telling them to prepare for what they called a brief and educational engagement with a species that has confused sentiment for strategy. Commander Osei intercepted that message, because human intelligence operatives had cracked Vraxith military encryption 40 years ago and had simply never told anyone. She read the message to her bridge crew, and they laughed too, but their laughter had a very different quality to it, the laughter of people who knew something that the enemy did not. The fleet jumped to hyperspace, and the stars stretched into lines of white light, and 2 million humans rode toward a battle that the galaxy would never forget. The Vraxith occupation fleet hung in orbit above Alori Prime, like a crown of iron and fire. 200 warships arranged in a defensive pattern that their commanders considered unbreakable. Below them, the Alori homeworld turned slowly in the light of its pale blue sun, and on its surface, 6 billion gentle insectoid beings lived under martial law, their great hive cities sealed, their queens held captive in crystalline towers, surrounded by Vraxith soldiers who had been told that the Alori were now property of the Dominion and should be treated accordingly. The Vraxith had set up sensor nets across every known approach vector to the system, and their early warning stations were staffed around the clock. Their fleet admiral, a tall, armored creature named Vrek Thosan, sat in his command throne aboard the dreadnought Eternal Dominion, and waited for the humans with the patient confidence of a predator that had never once been prey. Commander Osei brought the Terran repayment fleet through an uncharted jump route that human astrophysicists had spent 60 years mapping in secret. A narrow, unstable corridor through folded space that no sane navigator would ever attempt, because the margin of error was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Human navigators were very good at their jobs, and they were also, by galactic standards, completely insane. The fleet emerged from hyperspace inside the Alori system, behind the planet's largest moon, so close to the Vraxith defensive line that the first human ships were already firing before the Vraxith sensor operators had finished processing the jump signatures. The battle began in silence, as all battles in space do, and then the communication channels exploded with noise. Osei had designed what she called the Doctrine of Reciprocity, a battle plan built on a single principle: attack so fast and so close that the enemy's technological response is overwhelmed before it can engage. Advantages become meaningless. Galactic naval doctrine was built around long-range engagements, where ships exchanged fire across thousands of kilometers, and victory went to whoever had the better shields and the longer reach. Osei threw that doctrine out the airlock. Her capital ships accelerated to full combat speed and drove straight into the Vraxith formation, closing the distance so rapidly that the Vraxith gunners could not track them without risking hits on their own vessels. At close range, the battle became something the galaxy had never seen. Human warships pressed hull to hull against Vraxith dreadnoughts, firing broadsides at point-blank range, their improved shields absorbing punishment that would have destroyed any other fleet in the Concord, while their weapons tore through Vraxith armor like paper. It was brutal and ugly and absolutely terrifying, and the galaxy watched every second of it. Relay drones scattered throughout the system broadcast the battle, live, to every species with a data feed. And across 10,000 worlds, Beings of every shape and size stared at their screens in stunned silence as they watched the humans fight. They watched human pilots fly attack craft through the gaps in Vraxith ship superstructures, threading needles at combat speed with a precision that should not have been possible. They watched human marines in powered armor launch themselves across the void between ships, landing on Vraxith hulls and cutting their way inside with plasma torches, and they heard the marines talking to each other on open channels, joking, laughing, calling out targets with the casual ease of people who were doing something they had practiced 10,000 times. They watched a human destroyer, its shields failing and its hull cracked open to space, ram itself into the engine section of a Vraxith carrier 3 times its size, and detonate its reactor core, taking the carrier and 2 escorts with it, ships with it, and they heard the destroyer's captain singing, actually singing, in the last seconds before impact. The galaxy had seen wars before, but they had never seen anything like this. The Vraxith fought with discipline and superior numbers, and they were not cowards, but they had built their entire military doctrine on the assumption that no species would ever be reckless enough to close to night fighting range in a naval engagement. They were wrong, and that single miscalculation cost them everything. 6 hours into the battle, Vrek Thosan realized that he was losing and ordered a tactical withdrawal to regroup behind Alori Prime's second moon. But Osei had anticipated this and placed a wolf pack of stealth frigates along every possible retreat vector. The Vraxith fell back into an ambush, and the ambush became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. 9 hours in, Thosan made a decision born of rage and desperation. He ordered his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, to position itself directly above the largest Aelori hive city, a sprawling metropolis of crystal spires and singing chambers that held 300 million civilians. He activated the ship's planet bombardment array and sent a transmission to Osei on an open channel. "Withdraw your fleet or I will burn this city to glass," he said, and his voice carried the absolute conviction of someone who meant every word. Osei looked at the tactical display and did not respond for exactly 4 seconds. "You should check your reactor core," she said. Thosan frowned and opened a channel to his engineering section, and no one answered, because 6 hours ago, before the battle had even begun, a team of 32 human special operations soldiers had infiltrated the Eternal Dominion through its waste processing systems, and had spent the entire battle crawling through maintenance tunnels toward the ship's main reactor. With 4 seconds to spare before Thosan's bombardment sequence completed, and they did not disable the weapon gently, they physically ripped the power coupling out of the reactor housing with their armored hands, and the bombardment array went dark, and Thosan stared at his dead controls and understood for the first time that he had been outthought from the very beginning. The Special Operations Team leader, a sergeant named Don Backer, opened a channel to the Vraxith bridge and said 2 words, "Hands up." Thosan surrendered. The Battle of Alori Prime lasted 11 hours from the first shot to the last, and when it was over, the Vraxith had lost 119 ships, their fleet admiral was in human custody, and their occupation of the Alori homeworld was finished. Human casualties were 412 dead and 900 wounded, numbers that were remarkably low, not because humans were invincible, but because every single aspect of it. This battle had been planned, practiced, and refined for over a century. On the surface of Alori Prime, the Hive Queens were freed from their crystal prisons by human marines who handled the delicate insectoid rulers with such extraordinary gentleness that several of the queens began to weep, a behavior that Alori only displayed in moments of overwhelming emotional release. The queens gathered in the grand harmonic chamber of the capital hive city, and together they produced a sound that rippled outward through the atmosphere and into space, a deep, resonant vibration that every Alori understood, and that translates roughly into the human language as We are saved. We are remembered. We are not alone. The sound was picked up by every relay drone in the sector, and broadcast across the galaxy, and billions of beings heard it, without understanding the words, but understanding the feeling perfectly. Commander Osei stood on the bridge of her flagship, and listened to the Alori song, and for the first time since the battle began, the smile faded from her face, and was replaced by something softer. She whispered a single word that no one else on the bridge heard, a word that carried the weight of 200 years of gratitude. The Concord High Parliament had not seen this much chaos since the Rim Wars 3 centuries ago, and at least during the Rim Wars, everyone had agreed on who the enemy was. Now, no one could agree on anything. The chamber was a vast dome of living crystal on the station world of Aethys Prime, large enough to hold representatives from all 4,000 member species, and every seat was filled, and every voice was raised, and the noise was so overwhelming that the translation systems were struggling to keep up. The Vraxith delegation stood at the center of the floor and demanded justice. Their lead diplomat, a sharp-voiced female named Vren Kosal, pointed her clawed hand at the human section and delivered a speech that lasted 40 minutes and used the word aggression 107 times. Humanity had violated Concord's sovereignty, she said. Humanity had attacked a legitimate Vraxith territorial operation without provocation. Humanity had committed an act of war that could not go unanswered, and the Concord must respond with sanctions, with military force, with every tool available to punish this small, arrogant, insignificant species that had dared to raise its hand against the Vraxith Dominion. When she finished, the chamber erupted in argument, with half the species shouting support for the Vraxith, and the other half sitting in uncomfortable silence because they had watched the battle footage, and they were not sure they wanted to be on the side that was arguing against the people who had just done that. Into this chaos walked Director Yuna Tanaka. She was small even by human standards, and she moved slowly because her knees were not what they used to be. And she carried in her right hand a data crystal that caught the light of the chamber's crystal walls and threw tiny rainbows across the floor. She reached the speaker's platform at the center of the chamber, and stood there without saying a word until the noise died down, which took almost 3 minutes, because there was something about the way she stood, patient and still and utterly unbothered by 4,000 species screaming around her, that made people want to hear what she had to say. 200 years ago, she began, and her voice was soft enough that every being in the chamber had to lean forward to hear her. A plague came to Earth, and our people were dying, and we asked this parliament for help. She paused. This parliament said no. The silence in the chamber became heavier. Quarantine protocols were enacted, and Earth was sealed, and we were left to die. And the official record of the debate shows that the vote was 3,912 to 88. And I want every species in this room to consider which side of that vote they were on. She held up the data crystal. But 88 species voted to help us, and of those 88, 12 actually did it. 12 species that broke the quarantine and brought medicine and food and hope to a world full of strangers. And this parliament punished every single one of them for it. She pressed the crystal into the chamber's central projector, and above the heads of every diplomat in the room, 12 names appeared in light. The Dravani gave us shield technology and were stripped of their council seat for 30 years, she said, and her voice remained soft and steady and completely without anger. The Thalani gave us jump drive schematics and were fined so heavily that their economy collapsed for a generation. The Valesi sent doctors who died treating human patients, and this parliament repaid their sacrifice by banning them from galactic medical conferences for 2 decades. She went through all 12 names, one by one, and for each one she listed what they gave and what the Concord took from them as punishment. Each name, the chamber grew quieter and quieter, until by the time she reached the 12th name, there was no sound at all except the humming of the station's life support systems. The Alori, she said. And this was the third name, but she had saved it for last. Sent their entire medical fleet to Earth, and carried gene repair nanites that saved 6 billion lives. And this parliament sanctioned them so severely that their species has never fully recovered. She looked up at the floating names, and then back at the assembled diplomats. You taught the galaxy that compassion is punished, she said, and today we are here to teach you that it is rewarded. She pressed a second control on the projector, and the display changed, and every diplomat in the chamber felt their blood, or whatever equivalent fluid ran through their bodies, go cold. The display showed a tactical map of the galaxy with 12 points highlighted, one for each benefactor homeworld. Each point, a cluster of symbols that even the least militarily literate diplomat could recognize. Fleets. Human fleets. Not just the force that had liberated Alori Prime, but 11 more, each one positioned within striking distance of a benefactor homeworld. Not in orbit, not threatening, but present, visible, and unmistakably ready. The Terran repayment fleet has not stood down, Tanaka said, and it will not stand down. And I want to be very precise about what this means. Any species, any coalition, any empire that threatens a benefactor world will face the full military capability of humanity in response. And as you have seen at Alori Prime, that capability is considerably more significant than anyone in this chamber anticipated. The Vraxith diplomat tried to speak, but Tanaka continued as if she had not noticed. I also want to address something that I am certain many of you are thinking right now, she said, which is that humanity has been hiding its strength, and that this is somehow deceptive or dishonest. She smiled, and it was a warm smile, the kind a grandmother gives when explaining something obvious to a child. We hid nothing. We simply prepared, quietly, for the day when someone who had been kind to us would need our help. And we find it very interesting that so many species in this chamber are frightened by the idea that kindness might have consequences. She stepped back from the platform. We are not here to threaten anyone, and we are not here to conquer anything, and we have no interest in empire or expansion or any of the things that the Vraxith are going to accuse us of wanting. We are here because we owe a debt, and we are paying it. And when the debt is paid, we will go home, and we will continue to be the small, emotional, sentimental species that you have always believed us to be. She paused one final time. But we will remember. We will always remember. In this chamber is wondering whether it would have been wise to be kind to humanity when we were weak. I would suggest that the answer is now obvious. She walked off the platform, and behind her the 12 golden names still hung in the air above the chamber like a judgment. In the days that followed, the Vraxith Dominion attempted to build a coalition against humanity, sending diplomats to every major power in the Concord, with promises of shared resources and mutual defense against what they called the human threat. No one joined them. Not because every species in the galaxy suddenly loved humanity, and not because the Vraxith were weak, but because every diplomat who received the Vraxith offer looked at it, and then looked at the tactical map, and then asked themselves one very simple question. If the Vraxith had ever, even once, shown kindness to anyone, would they have allies now? The answer was no, and the Vraxith knew it. Realization was worse than any military defeat. Across the galaxy, species that had dismissed humanity for 2 centuries began sending quiet messages to Earth's embassies. Not demands, not threats, but something much more unusual in galactic politics. Invitations, offers of friendship, small gestures of goodwill that meant nothing strategically, but meant everything symbolically, because the galaxy had learned a lesson that it would never forget. That in a universe of cold transactions and ruthless self-interest, one small species had built the most powerful military force anyone had ever seen, for no other reason than to protect the people who had once been kind to them. and that was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever heard. 5 years passed. The galaxy was not the same place it had been before humanity repaid its debt. The change did not come through war or conquest, or any of the loud, violent methods that empires had used to reshape civilizations since the first species looked up from its homeworld and decided that the stars belonged to them. It came quietly, the way water reshapes stone, slowly, patiently, and with a force that nothing could resist. The 12 benefactors had formed the Compact of Reciprocity with Earth, a mutual defense and trade alliance that operated on principles so simple that most galactic diplomats could not believe they were real. If a member was attacked, all members would respond. If a member was in need, all members would help. If a member was wronged, all members would stand witness. There were no secret clauses, no hidden agendas, no fine print designed to give one species an advantage over another. Agreement between 13 civilizations that had decided to trust each other, backed by the quiet certainty that humanity would enforce every word of it with 800 warships and 2 million soldiers who had proven at Elori Prime that they were very, very good at their jobs. Within 2 years, the Compact had become the most powerful political bloc in the Concord, not because it had the most members, but because it had something far more valuable: credibility. When the Compact said it would defend its members, every species in the galaxy believed it, because they had watched the footage from Elori Prime, and they had listened to Director Tanaka's speech, and they understood that humans did not make promises they did not intend to keep. The Elori thrived under the Compact's protection in ways that no one had predicted. Freed from the threat of Vraxith annexation and supported by human technology and trade, the gentle insectoid species experienced a cultural renaissance that their historians would later call the Second Flowering. New hive cities rose from the crystalline plains of their homeworld. Their population grew for the first time in a century, and their harmonic arts reached levels of complexity and beauty that drew visitors from across the galaxy. The Elori High Queen, an ancient being named Cyretha, who had lived through the occupation and the liberation, commissioned a great sculpture for the central chamber of the capital hive city. A towering work of crystal and light that depicted an Elori medical ship approaching a small blue world, and beneath it, a single phrase in both Elori harmonic notation and human English that said, "Kindness echoes." The Vraxith Dominion, meanwhile, was dying. Not from military defeat. Humanity had made it clear that it had no interest in invading Vraxith space or destroying their civilization, but from something far more devastating: isolation. The Dominion had built its empire on fear and economic coercion, holding vassal species in place through threats and dependency. And for centuries that had worked, because no one in the galaxy offered an alternative. Now there was an alternative. One by one, the Vraxith vassal states began to defect, not to the Compact, because most of them had no historical connection to Earth, but simply away from the Dominion, because the existence of the Compact proved that it was possible to build alliances based on something other than fear. The Vraxith could not hold them. Their military was still powerful, but every time they considered using force against a defecting vassal, they looked at the human fleets positioned around the benefactor worlds and remembered what had happened the last time they had underestimated a species that fought for something it believed in. Within 3 years, the Dominion had lost half its vassal states, and within 5 years, it had contracted to its original borders, a shadow of the empire it had once been, surrounded by species that no longer feared it and had no reason to trade with it. Vrek Thosan, the former fleet admiral who had been captured at Elori Prime, was returned to the Dominion as part of a prisoner exchange, and when reporters asked him what he had learned from his time in human custody, he said something that became famous across the galaxy. "They treated me well," he said, and there was genuine confusion in his voice, as if this simple fact had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the universe. And I asked them why, and they said it was because cruelty was expensive and kindness was free, and I still do not fully understand what they meant by that. Admiral Cale Morrow retired from active service in the 3rd year after the battle, and he spent most of his time in Geneva, walking through the city's old streets, and sitting in cafes, and reading books that had nothing to do with war. On the first day, he would visit the Hall of Gratitude, and stand before the Great Black Wall, and read the 12 names. The wall had changed since the liberation. New names had been added, not just the 12 benefactors, but dozens of other species that had helped humanity in smaller ways over the past 2 centuries. Acts of kindness so minor that the species who had performed them did not even realize they had been noticed. A Kelori freighter captain who had towed a stranded human colony ship to safety and refused payment. A Drassian medical researcher who had shared her work on neural repair with a human university without being asked. A Venn diplomat who had spoken in humanity's defense during a trade dispute when it would have been easier and safer to stay silent. All of their names were on the wall now, carved in stone and gilded in gold, and Morrow read every one of them each time he visited because he believed that remembering was the most important thing a person could do. It was during one of these visits, on a cold morning in January, that he met the young Tessari diplomat. The Tessari were a new species. They had achieved spaceflight only 20 years ago, and they were small and fragile and terrified of the galaxy they had just entered, which was understandable, because the galaxy could be a very frightening place for a species that had no military, no allies, and no idea who to trust. The young diplomat's name was Kirena, and she had come to the Hall of Gratitude because she had heard the stories and wanted to see the wall for herself. She was standing in front of it when Morrow arrived, her wide dark eyes moving across the names, and she was trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was seeing. Morrow stood beside her and said nothing for a long time, because he had learned over many years that sometimes the most respectful thing you could do was let someone feel what they were feeling without interruption. Finally, Kirena spoke, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is it true that if we show you kindness, you will never forget?" Morrow looked at her, this small, frightened being from a world he had never visited, standing in a hall built to honor debts that were older than she was, and he felt something tighten in his chest. He knelt so that his eyes were level with hers, and he spoke gently, the way he would speak to anyone who was afraid. "We carved the names of those who helped us into stone," he said, "and we built warships and named them after our friends, and we spent 150 years preparing to fight for people who were kind to us when we had nothing to offer in return." He gestured at the wall behind him, at the golden names that caught the morning light and glowed as if they were alive. "So yes," he said, "we remember, and the galaxy is beginning to learn what that means." Kirena looked at the wall one more time, and then she looked at the old human kneeling before her, and something in her expression changed. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it made room for something else, something that looked very much like hope. She reached into her satchel and produced a small crystal, pale blue and warm to the touch, and she pressed it into Morrow's hand. "On my world," she said, "we give these to people we trust, and I do not know if it means anything to your people, but I want you to have it." Morrow closed his fingers around the crystal and held it carefully, as if it were the most precious thing he had ever been given. "It means everything," he said. He stood up, and he walked to the office of the hall's keeper, and he requested that a new name be added to the wall, the Tessari, for a gift of trust given freely to a species they barely knew. The keeper noted the request and began preparing the stone cutter. Outside, the sun rose over Geneva, and across the galaxy, 4,000 species went about their lives, in a universe that had been quietly and permanently changed by a single, terrifying idea. That there existed a species that never forgot a kindness, that repaid every debt, no matter how long it took, and that had built the most powerful war machine the galaxy had ever seen, for no other purpose than to protect those who had once been good to them. Centuries later, a galactic historian would write the definitive account of humanity's impact on interstellar civilization, and the final line of that account would be taught in schools on 10,000 worlds for generations to come. The humans did not conquer the galaxy. They did something far more terrifying. They made loyalty the most powerful force in it. And every species, from the mightiest empire to the smallest colony world, learned the same lesson. Be kind to the humans, because they always repay their debts.